Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second episode of the McGill AI podcast. My name is Bonnie, and I'm here with Cole. And we're tremendously excited to have Professor Blake Richards joining us today. Professor Richards is a leading researcher at the intersection of neuroscience and AI. He is an assistant professor at McGill, a Canada CIFAR AI Chair, and a core faculty member at Mila. His research explores the general principles of learning and memory in neural networks and trying to understand how real and artificial brains can optimize behaviors.
Sweet. Yeah, so today we're specifically going to be talking about a variety of things, mainly starting off with Blake's Richard interests and then how neuroscience sort of inspires an AI and at the same time how AI influences neuroscience. And then, of course, sort of the ethical aspects of the research and advice for students looking to get into the field. So yeah, starting off and maybe trying to get to know Blake a little bit better, could you tell us about your personal background and your journey to sort of where you are today?
Sure. So thanks very much for having me today. I'll just start off by saying that. And then, so on my background, I had a kind of odd path to get to the specific research area that my lab is focused on now. My original undergraduate training was in artificial intelligence and cognitive science at the University of Toronto. And while I was there, I actually found myself feeling very frustrated with artificial intelligence as a discipline. It was not terribly inspiring, let's say, to see what had been achieved over the course of 40 years of research at that point in time. I suppose we could say maybe 50 years of research at that point in time. This is the late 1990s, early 2000s. And I, in particular, was saddened by how toy all of the AI systems we had seemed to be. They could only solve very limited problems, and they could only operate within very limited domains, and they couldn't really ever be applied to any real-world tasks or settings. And moreover, it felt like they just were ad hoc assemblages of sort of bits of logical programming and the occasional heuristic and stuff like this. But while I was there, I ended up taking a couple of courses on neural networks, and I was very inspired by that work. It was the first time in artificial intelligence that I really felt like there was something kind of interesting and potentially beneficial there. It helped that I was at the University of Toronto, where I could take neural networks with Jeff Hinton, and he was, of course, a very inspiring teacher in this area and very convincing as to their utility. But this was before the whole deep learning revolution took off. So at this point in time, it was still kind of considered niche and no one was paying any attention to it. And I decided that I was interested in potentially actually figuring out how real brains worked, given that I found artificial neural networks so compelling. So I went off to do graduate studies in neuroscience and ended up pursuing a research career that was largely neuroscience focused for a lot of time. But then when I started my own lab, it was around when deep learning was finally taking off. And people in artificial intelligence were once again paying attention to these artificial neural network models. So it, for me, was kind of natural then to, once I had become an independent researcher, return to the thing that had originally motivated me to go into neuroscience, these artificial neural network models. But because I was in neuroscience, I ended up really kind of applying those neural network models to understanding the brain. Over the course of time in my lab, based both on what our interests were, the students I recruited, and the funding we obtained, the research program kind of evolved into this 50-50 mix between kind of AI considerations and neuroscience considerations. And that's sort of how I got to where I'm at now.
Wow, yeah, that's super sweet. Sort of starting with the pre-neural network AI, getting inspired into neuroscience, and then coming back to where you started with more sort of advanced AI that could be seen more from the side of neuroscience. Mm-hmm. I'm curious, like, even once you sort of settled down into that balance of neuroscience and AI and sort of the intersection of the two, how has your research within that intersection moved over time? Have you had sort of periods of time where you were intensely focused on one topic or another?
Yeah, so I would say that there are certain core aspects of our research that have remained semi-constant. So one of the things we're most interested in is the question of how does the brain solve the credit assignment problem? This was one of the first things that we kind of entered into in this area. What that means, how does the brain solve the credit assignment problem, is the following. When you are training some agent, whether it be an animal or an artificial neural network, the learning necessarily involves changes to the agent somehow. So physical changes to your brain or changes to the synaptic weight parameters in your neural network, for example. And in order to ensure that your system actually gets better at whatever task you're training it on over time, you need to have some way of determining which physical changes or which parameter changes will actually help the system to get better. And in any kind of nonlinear and or hierarchical or recurrent network or agent, this is a very difficult problem. Answering which changes or which parameters are responsible for any errors or successes in the learning task is not necessarily an easy thing. Now, it just so happens that for artificial neural networks, we have a solution to the credit assignment problem, which is the very famous backpropagation algorithm. And it works very well. It tells us how to change the synaptic weights in our neural networks so as to get better at different tasks. And so one of the areas of focus in my lab has been how does the brain figure out which physical changes it needs to make to itself in order to make us better at various tasks. And for this, we've actually relied on theory from artificial intelligence and ideas from backpropagation to try to think about how biology could possibly solve this credit assignment problem. So that was something that we got onto early in my lab and have continued to work on. But over time, we've come to focus, I'd say, more on ideas that are less about just simply answering neuroscience problems with AI and more about actually trying to develop AI systems that are actually influenced by how neuroscience works. And so more recently, I have had various people join the lab who are interested in things like developing AI systems that have memories that are more similar to the sorts of memories that we actually have, we being humans and mammals, perhaps more broadly, and developing systems that can use those memories in the ways that we do to make intelligent decisions. So this has been a slightly newer direction, but one that's been growing in the lab. And there are, of course, many other research projects going on, but I'd say this has kind of been the shift, is from solving neuroscience problems with AI theory, which we still do, to also thinking about how to develop better AI with neuroscience insights.
Yeah, that's awesome. And those are both like super interesting questions. I guess we could start with sort of the first one, which is learning about neuroscience. And it'd be awesome to hear more about this credit assignment problem. And does it look like biology uses backpropagation, or how do they do it?
Well, so biology cannot do backpropagation. There's a variety of reasons that backpropagation is itself problematic for a biological system to do. One of the most obvious reasons is in backpropagation. What happens is you propagate your activity forward through your neural network, then you calculate your error, and then you do a backwards pass with your errors to calculate how you update your synaptic parameters. That is fine in a neural network, but in an animal that's constantly receiving a stream of information from the environment, you can't hit pause and do a backpropagation of errors through the network. This is just one example. There are a variety of other potentially biologically problematic assumptions in backpropagation. So the thing is, though, backpropagation is actually just a specific way of solving the credit assignment problem with a broader strategy known as gradient descent. So gradient descent is specifically the strategy of taking defining some loss function, which measures how badly you're doing at learning, and then calculating the gradient or in one dimension, the slope of your loss function with respect to your synaptic parameters, and going down that gradient. So basically trying to walk downhill in your loss function so that you get to the lowest possible loss, which corresponds to the best possible behavior. And there are other ways of doing gradient descent than backpropagation. So what I personally think is the brain probably does have some way of approximating gradient descent. And my lab, as well as several other labs around the world, have demonstrated that there are, in fact, ways that brains could approximate gradient descent. Now, if any of these actually holds in the brain is basically a matter to be determined over the next decade of research. It's possible that none of them are correct and the brain does something totally different. But it's also possible that we have, either my lab or some other labs, have hit upon something that actually does correspond to reality. Either way, what I can say concretely is it's by no means impossible that the brain could do gradient descent. We and others have shown it's possible. And so then the question is trying to figure out whether it does it and whether any of these models are actually predictive of reality.
That's sweet, yeah. And one thing that really stuck out to me was, so you mentioned one reason backpropagation is problematic is because you can't really pause the brain to perform that sort of computation. And so the first thing that comes to mind is sleep. And like
Right.
wondering what have you looked, like, has your lab focused on sort of where sleep plays into this whole equation, or yeah, what's the deal there?
Yeah, so sleep is interesting, and there have been many models that have tried to use sleep as a component of credit assignment, and there are various other theories about how sleep can help learning. The issue with using sleep for credit assignment in the way that we do it with backpropagation is that technically what you'd have to do is somehow store every piece of data you encountered throughout the day and then recapitulate it during your sleep in order to do your error backpropagation. And there's no good evidence that that happens during sleep. There's some evidence that your brain does replay some components of your experiences from the day when you sleep. But the evidence suggests that this is not a kind of systematic replay of everything that occurred to you or all the learning events, but instead an exploration of certain events, possibly for extracting additional information from them. And so I think it's safe to say that sleep is definitely involved in learning, but it's probably not how the brain achieves something like the backwards pass and backpropagation.
That's really interesting. Replay experiences during sleep. That's a really interesting idea. Oh, actually, let's look at like storing all experiences for a second. So I know you've done a lot of work on that. And right, AI in reinforcement learning, how memory is done is we have this replay buffers that we literally store all of our experiences in, and then we sample and learn from these replay buffers later. And this can get quite memory intensive for computers. So we do better than simply just storing all these experiences. And could you tell us a bit about your work on memory and what does memory look like from a neuroscience perspective?
Sure, yeah. So I think it's useful to contrast what's going on in the brain with exactly the sort of system that you described just now, which is, so in AI, in deep reinforcement learning, what people often do right now, as you said, is they'll store this big, package of all of the things that happen to the AI agent during some learning event, whether it be playing a video game or whatever. And then they replay these events and learn from them. And they replay the events many, many times over, and they just literally perfectly recapitulate what happened during the initial experience and learn from that. So that is not what happens with your memory in the brain. So your memory is not by any means a perfect recapitulation of exactly what's happened to you over the course of some period of time. First and foremost, the evidence is that you don't actually store the exact images that your retina receives or your skin feels, the smells, etc. But instead, you're storing some high-level kind of abstract representation of that experience. Now, you can then attach certain sensory details to those memories. So you can have this abstract understanding of what occurred to you and then attach some specific details to it and recall those later. And that sort of memory where you've kind of attached an understanding of what's happened to you to specific sensory details is part of a type of memory in the brain called episodic memory, which are memories for specific events that have occurred to you and some of the details about what was involved in those events. And so some people kind of sometimes try to like to suggest that episodic memory is like these replay buffers, but it really isn't, because first of all, episodic memory does not perfectly recapitulate all of the sensory details. It's just certain salient sensory details that seem to be bound to this more abstract understanding. And secondly, episodic memory, unlike these other forms of memory like the replay buffer, is actually quite liable for you to forget. Most of your episodic memories you forget quite rapidly. So you might have a very clear episodic memory of what happened to you like an hour ago, maybe even this morning. You can recall what you ate for breakfast and what it tasted like. But if I ask you, what did your breakfast taste like a week ago, you're going to have trouble recalling that. And so the ways in which episodic memories actually get used by the brain are complicated and we don't fully understand it yet. But I think what's safe to say is that it's not that episodic memories are used as a replay buffer in the way that replay buffers get used in deep reinforcement learning agents. However, we do replay our episodic memories to some extent, and they seem to be used for additional learning. And what the evidence suggests that way is that what's happening with episodic memories and the way that they get used for additional learning is that we use them to learn a kind of more general model of the environment. And during sleep, during rest, over the course of our kind of processing of our episodic memories, part of what happens is we can extract commonalities from across our episodic memories and also make links between various things that have happened to us. And in this way, build up a better understanding of the life that we have lived in a way that allows us to have better predictions of the nature of the environment and more abstract understandings of the rules that govern it. So, I think we're still learning a lot about how episodic memories get used in the brain. And I think in addition to this kind of learning, another component of it that's missing from the current AI models is that, although not all AI models, I should say, there are some models that do exactly this. Another component is that we use our episodic memories to actually make decisions. So, you have an episodic memory for something that happened to you earlier today. And if that ends up being relevant to a decision you have to make later in the day, you're going to use that information to make your decision. So for example, if you, are walking to work and the usual route you take turns out to be blocked and you have this memory of seeing the sign, the infamous Rue Barré or Trois Barré in Montreal, then you will use that memory for seeing that sign in a particular location to take a different route back at the end of the day. And that sort of like using of your memories to inform your decision making is something that only a few AI systems nowadays actually use. But it should be said, those AI systems were actually directly inspired by episodic memory. So for example, one of the kind of well-known models like this is something called neural episodic control from DeepMind, which was directly inspired by episodic memory. And indeed, it does just that. It stores memories of some things that have happened in the past and uses those memories to try to inform its decisions in later points in time.
Wow, that's really fascinating to hear about replay buffer and how episodic. How do you even go about studying something like episodic memory in the human brain? Like, what does that process look like for as a researcher?
Yeah, and even a similar note, it'd be cool to hear about what the timeline of neuroscience research has looked like. Where like when did epistemic memory sort of even an understanding for that come about, and then even looking into the future, you mentioned trying to understand whether or not the brain uses gradient descent. What kind of timeline might we be able to see that on?
Okay, so I'll start with the question of what studies of episodic memory look like, and maybe I'll tie into that the sort of timeline on how neuroscience got to where it is and where I think we'll be going in the future on that. So the way you study episodic memory in neuroscience is ultimately that you have to devise behavioral tests for people and animals that somehow get at their episodic memories. Now, in the case of animals, psychologists insist on calling them episodic-like memories because you can't directly ask the animal about the sensory details in the environment, and so you have to design behavioral tests that try to indirectly get at this question. But nonetheless, that's the idea. So you design behavioral tests. So for example, you will design a test where a person will have some experience, and then later you ask them questions, and they'll only be able to answer these questions if they've successfully stored episodic memories for their experiences. An example might be, there was a study from researcher Brian Levine at the University of Toronto where they actually had participants do a tour through the hospital that their research lab was in, and did so with a camera on them so that the researchers could actually have a record of what the participant experienced over the course of this tour, and then they'd later ask them questions about it. So what was the color of the door after you in the hallway next to the cafe, or what was the painting of in the main lobby, things like this. And then you can test this. You can score this, and you can say, okay, did the people have memory of the specific course of events that occurred to them? And there are other ways you can do this in the laboratory as well without wandering around, but that's perhaps the kind of most intuitive example. So you develop these behavioral tests, and then you're going to want to use the typical toolbox that neuroscientists have for studying the brain to try to pick apart what circuits are involved, what they're doing, and when things go wrong, what goes wrong. So if you don't successfully recall an episodic memory, what's happened? And in an animal, if you design a little test for it to test its episodic-like memory, are there ways that you can manipulate it? Or alternatively, can you record from the neurons in the appropriate circuits to see what they're doing when it recalls the episodic memory, stuff like that. So there's this entire kind of field of studying episodic memory in neuroscience, and many, many researchers who explore it. This entire field took off basically in the 1980s following the original definition of episodic memory, which came from a psychologist at Toronto named Endel Tulving. And Tulving was basically the first to identify this distinction between memories for specific things that have happened in our lives where we can recall these sensory details about them, and the sort of general semantic memory that's what Tulving termed it, that we have, which represents our core knowledge of the world, right? So at some point, for example, someone told you that the technical head of state of Canada is Queen Elizabeth. And so that. If I ask you, you have a memory for that, but you probably don't have any of the details of what happened to you when someone said that to you. So that's a semantic memory, not an episodic memory. And from the moment that Tulving kind of identified the differences between these two types of memories, psychologists and scientists have been studying them and exploring them, and have shown, for example, that different brain circuits seem to be involved, and there are ways in which the two types of memory can inform each other, and various things like this. I think we're at the point with episodic memory where we know fairly well which circuits are involved, and there's some really interesting theories for how they operate. And the principal question over the next few years will be whether or not we can actually connect those theories to empirical data. It's always the challenge in neuroscience, because often the empirical data we can collect is not necessarily the direct prediction that our models would make, which, you know, ideally we'd have total access to the brain in order to check the predictions of those models, but that's very complicated even in animals. With respect to the little second part of the question, I think, you know, my hope would be that over the next decade, we figure out how the brain solves the credit assignment problem. Maybe that's overly bullish. Maybe it's going to take 2 decades, something like that. I think we will eventually get there, though. And I think we've made a lot of good, again, theoretical progress. And now the task before us, and something that myself and many other people are working on, is really figuring out how to ground that out in the experimental evidence so that we can move from theory to validation.
That's really interesting to hear. So you mentioned the almost disconnect between the theory and the empirical data. So how are these theories like hypothesized in the first place without grounding in the empirical data?
Well, the theories are grounded in empirical data, but the predictions that they make are not necessarily easy to check empirically. So all of the existing theories are based on reams of empirical data showing both, you know, how memories work in the brain for this question of episodic memory and learning, or questions of how neurons work and how circuits work for solving the credit assignment problem. So it's not that there's a total disconnect between the theories and the experiments, but the difficulty is that, you know, you can come up with a theory, for example, of how the brain solves the credit assignment problem, and that theory will make some predictions, but many of those predictions will be predictions that would require, say, here's a perfect example. The ideal situation would be that we could track the synaptic connections in real neural circuits over time as an animal learns. If we could do that, we could validate a lot of the predictions that come out of these models, but we cannot. There is no way for us to measure the synaptic connection between 2 neurons other than with very, very difficult experiments that require a whole host of huge experimental apparatus, basically, and which make it almost impossible to do this over the course of learning. So there's just no way for us right now to track the synaptic connections across a neural circuit in a learning animal. It's just experimentally infeasible. And that means then that all of the predictions that come out of the models that say, well, here's how the synapses should change over time if this is how the credit assignment is done, can't be tested. So instead you have to figure out, okay, well, given the experimental tools we have, what predictions can we make that are actually observable from the experimental tools at hand? And that's essentially something that cannot be left aside. It is the immediate task for those of us who are interested in this credit assignment problem. But the same holds for a lot of the theories of episodic memory and other things like that. There's all sorts of interesting components in the theories, which if you had total access to the brain experimentally, maybe you could verify some of the predictions, but instead we're going to have to figure out, well, what sorts of predictions can we actually measure? As a sort of analogy, you know, the way I'd think about it is like, if you think about how physicists ultimately verified the theory of relativity, they couldn't actually watch space-time bending, right? You can't experimentally see that happen. Instead, you have to look for indirect effects like the curvature of light around a star or something like that. And so they devised various experimental predictions that could actually tie into the sorts of things they could actually measure. And that's basically what we have to do with all these models, is figure out, okay, since we can't directly measure the thing the model predicts, can we at least make some indirect predictions from that core idea?
So you mentioned using these models to make predictions. Like, what kind of models are we talking about? Are we talking about models that follows the laws of physics? Are we talking about like machine learning models that makes predictions? What kind of
So, I mean, what I really, when I say models here, I mean basically mathematical descriptions of what the neural circuits are doing. So typically we use abstracted models of neurons, like artificial neural networks. And sometimes we make them a bit more realistic. We'll add a bit more biology into the models. But at the end of the day, that's roughly the name of the game, is these sort of abstract artificial neural networks. And so the models consist of a set of mathematical equations that describe how those neural circuits should change over time and how they learn from data in the environment. And the predictions then consist of, mappings between, okay, like if I do this to the artificial neural network, this is how its activity changes, or this is how its weights change, or if I give it this type of data, here's the kind of thing it learns. And then you can compare those ideas, like so if I give it a particular type of data and it learns this type of feature, then I can ask, do animals learn that type of feature if I give it that type of data, for example?
Oh,
Sweet. Yeah. So first off, I just want to say this from a little bit before, but it was just sort of, for me, a bit mind-blowing when you made this connection to like semantic memory versus epistemic, and the idea that
Episodic.
Sorry, I get that word. It was just the idea that like all the knowledge that we have, like all the knowledge stems from some memory, but we don't know what those memories are. We just remember the knowledge, and there are like the alternative, we do remember the memory. But that was just sort of crazy to realize. Everything we know comes originally from a memory in a way. But yeah, so anyway, you were sort of now just discussing models and neural circuits and sort of mathematically trying to analyze them. And it'd be cool to hear more about the parallels between biological neural circuits and sort of machine learning neural networks, and sort of stuff like loss functions and activation functions, perceptrons. And there are some parallels between those. There.
Well, indeed, there are lots of parallels. So I think one of the things that probably a lot of computer science students don't realize is that the original neural network models were designed not for artificial intelligence, but to be models of the brain. So when people say, is there any connection between, neuroscience and these artificial neural networks, it always makes me laugh a little bit, because the connection was there from the get-go. So, one of the earliest models was a model from McGill and Pitts, which basically was a model of how you could do Boolean logic with neuron-like units. And their goal there was to try to model what was happening in the brain. And this inspired later researchers in the early phase of this field, such as Rosenblatt, who really was the one that took the perceptron as far as it could go at that time. And if you read Rosenblatt's writings, so this is like, early 1960s, late 1950s, Rosenblatt's explicit. He's like, I intend this to be a model of the brain, not a system for AI. Now, many people then, I think, are like, well, but these aren't like neurons. How could that be? But there's a bit of a misunderstanding here when people say that, both about the nature of science and modeling and about the goals of these original researchers. So any model is an abstraction of reality. You can't get around it. If you look at Newtonian physics, it's not a perfect description of what's happening in reality. It's an abstraction of it. And there is no model in science that is a perfect correspondence to the reality. Necessarily, what we're doing is we take the empirical observations that we have and we try to develop a set of equations that can describe those empirical observations. And we allow ourselves the fact that the empirical observations will not perfectly match the model. we need to have some level of abstraction in order to successfully make the model mathematically tractable, and also for the sake of Occam's razor, right? Just because we don't want our models to get too insane too quickly. So there's just a component of abstraction in any model, and that's, you know, what motivated McCullough and Pitts, for example. They were like, we know neurons have all sorts of things going on that we're not capturing with our model here, but they were trying to get at the core features of neurons that they thought were important. So for example, neurons, and this is just a known fact, this is like, no one doubts this, this is one of the best, you know, articulated facts in neuroscience. Neurons receive signals from many other neurons. They will integrate those signals. And when I say integrate, I mean that in the mathematical sense, like they literally integrate the signals from the different neurons. And then the integral of those inputs will determine whether or not the neuron gets to its threshold for firing something called an action potential. An action potential is just a little electrical signal that it then sends out to the rest of the neurons. And so McCullough and Pitt's original model basically took these core findings and they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that the network is composed of groups of units that integrate the outputs from all the other units. And if those outputs reach some threshold, they're going to fire a signal to the rest of the units. And this very abstract level description of how neurons operate was kind of the initial motivation behind their model, and then in turn the perceptron model. The way that we now view this, and the way to kind of understand where the field's gone this way, is that when you think about any, so getting back to this idea of abstraction, when you think about any computational system, you can describe that computational system at multiple levels of abstraction. There was a computational neuroscientist by the name of David Marr who in the early 80s articulated a specific categorization for these different levels of abstraction. And he proposed this idea that you can talk about the computational level, which is the question of what are the functions that the computer is actually computing. There's the algorithmic level, which is the question of what algorithm, so what recipe does the system follow to arrive at those computations? And then the implementation level, which is what hardware is actually used to implement the algorithms that do the computations. And so when you look at artificial neural networks, where they ended up going and where the researchers, so like Rosenblatt and stuff, as I said, were very clear, they were modeling the brain. And likewise, the researchers in the 1980s who developed what was called the parallel distributed processing framework, which is really basically deep learning. Deep learning is just taking ideas from that and tweaking it. The parallel distributed processing framework researchers were very clear. They were like, okay, so like McCullough and Pitts and Rosenblatt, our goal here is to model the brain. And what we're doing is we're trying to model the brain at kind of the algorithmic level. So we're trying to understand what algorithms the brain uses in order to arrive at the computations that it successfully engages in. And what we're not doing is we're not modeling the implementation level. So we're not modeling the hardware that actually causes these algorithms to exist in our brains. In other words, they're not modeling sodium channels and lipid bilayers and protein folding and all of the things that actually matter for how it really physically occurs in your brain. So when we think of the connections between artificial neural networks and brains, it's important to understand that artificial neural networks are, on some level, an algorithmic level model of the brain. They describe, we think, in some ways, the algorithms that our brains use to engage in certain computations, but they do not match the biological implementations. They do not have any model within them of proteins or ion flow, et cetera, et cetera. So the connection very much so still sits there. And many researchers in artificial intelligence are still trying to use inspiration from the brain to develop algorithms for AI. And that ultimately means developing artificial neural networks that we think match the brain's algorithms. And then, so part of how this then plays out is that, the way that you develop an algorithm with an artificial neural network is ultimately you have to define the architecture of the network. So how do the different modules connect to one another? And then the loss function. What is your measure of behavior that you're going to try to get better at over time? And what I would argue is that we can actually, in parallel, do a similar sort of question in the brain. We can ask, what is the architecture at the algorithmic level of the circuits that exist in the brain? And also, what are the loss functions that the brain uses to improve itself and to get better at certain things? And this is a big part of what our research program is concerned with, actually.
Cool. So as you mentioned, I think you also wrote in your paper a deep learning framework for neuroscience. You mentioned the three key components. You mentioned the three central components for artificial learning systems are the architecture, the learning rules, and the objective. So we talked a bit about architecture, a bit on the learning rule as well. Now let's take a look at the objective. Are there objectives for the brain? And what are the objectives from a biological standpoint?
Right. So that is part of the research question that, we in this area are trying to explore. What are the objective functions or loss functions? Those are just different ways of describing the same thing. What are the objectives that the brain has in its learning? So for example, we had a recent paper that came out that showed that if your objective, so if you design an artificial neural network whose objective is to take a stream of visual information, i.e. like a movie, and your objective is to use some of the past frames to predict the upcoming future frames, then the neural network will develop representations that actually match the real brain's representations fairly well. And I think that indeed there's growing evidence that one of the objective functions that shapes the brain is predicting the future. So your brain is constantly trying to predict what's going to happen next, and it shapes itself based on this objective. There are, of course, other key objectives related to what we might call rewards. And this, of course, ties into reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning, it should be noted, again, it's kind of, I always find it funny when people say, well, AI doesn't really gain inspiration from neuroscience. Reinforcement learning was explicitly developed on the backbone of findings from psychology and neuroscience in the early to mid 20th century. And the core idea behind reinforcement learning is indeed to take rewards and use them to shape behavior and decision making. And we see that very clearly in animals. One of the most remarkable things about animals is that you can, not all animals, one of the most remarkable things about, let's say, certain species of animal is that if you give them a reward for doing certain behaviors, or you give them a punishment for doing other behaviors, you can shape their behavior. They will do more of the things that you give them rewards for and less of the things that you give them punishments for. And this is clearly one of the objectives that the brain is trying to maximize. Now, there's some complications here, it should be said, because unlike in reinforcement learning in, say, an Atari game where the reward is very obvious, it's like your score in the game, the reward that an animal experiences is complicated. And it's not always something that you can necessarily predict what's rewarding and what's not rewarding for the animal. The clearest example of that is with respect to satiety, right? So a hungry animal will find food very, very rewarding, but a full animal, not so much. And so, when you're training an animal, for example, using food-based rewards, you have to make sure they're hungry. Otherwise, you're not going to successfully train them. And so there's some complications there. So it's not quite fair to say that it's just, well, you get rewards and rewards mean whatever, food and sex and stuff like that. There's some internal complicated process that happens in our brain that is deciding what's rewarding and what's not. And then, however that process happens, what we can say is that what gets identified as rewarding by the brain, you then have as an objective to maximize. And you will do whatever you need to do to maximize that. And this is why, you know, all of us know this sensation of not necessarily wanting to do something and yet kind of feeling compelled to do it because in some level it was rewarding for us at some point in time, right? That's like something that we all face, and sometimes we face it to more or less degrees, right? Someone who's addicted to a drug has this in spades. They surely know that they should not constantly be doing crystal meth, but the problem is it triggers the various reward circuits in their brain, and so they will engage in the behavior of taking crystal meth regardless of how much some part of them knows this is a poor choice. And we all face this constantly. This is why the very concept of willpower and self-control is something we have to contend with. So that's definitely another objective that's shaping our brain. And I'd say those are the two that we can be sure about: reward maximization and prediction. What are the other objectives that are shaping our brain? That's unclear. I think there's other evidence for some other ones. There's probably also objectives regarding energy minimization and potentially objectives regarding what's called optimal control. So yeah, I personally view the kind of goal of neuroscience over the next 50 years to be determining what those objective functions are that shape the brain. And that's basically, you know, the major project before us.
Wow, it's really interesting to hear about the two objectives on predicting the future and on rewards in the brain. And I think these are interestingly somewhat replicated in deep reinforcement learning systems. So some reinforcement learning papers study build a world model predicting how the world. So given a state, you can have an abstraction of the state and try to predict what the abstraction could look like. And with such world model, you could possibly even do imagination. You can do rollout the latent space and learn from there. And another related idea is curiosity. So implementing curiosity is actually, as you mentioned, prediction error minimization. We simply minimize the error of our prediction about the world. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts around world models like these in trying to predict the future? Are we predicting the future of every frame that we saw? And what are your thoughts around the notion of imagination and curiosity as well?
Yeah, so I mean, these are very interesting questions. I think the best answer to I think your broader question is that indeed, I suspect the brain does build a world model and use that to make predictions. And I suspect that will be critical for the development of AI systems as well. It's already shown to be very useful. The other component of your question, though, is, you know, where do we make those predictions? How often are we making them? On that, I suspect the answer in the brain is that we're actually doing it at multiple levels. So you're actually probably both simultaneously predicting very low level sensory features, what you're going to see, what you're going to hear, what you're going to taste. And at the same time, there are other parts of your brain that are trying to make much more kind of high level abstract predictions about, like, okay, what's going to happen as a result of this action over the course of the next few hours, things like that, right? Or even farther in the future. If I do X, what's going to happen next month, right? These different levels of prediction are probably key to how the brain operates, and something that we can start to think about building into AI systems. As it stands, there are some models that do this, but not a ton. But it is surely kind of how the brain operates this way, because we can make predictions both on low-level sensory features and on high-level abstract concepts. And this is all intimately related to imagination, because imagination is partially about thinking about, given, you know, the various things you know about the world, what what would you predict if you changed this or changed that, right? Our imagination is never fully untethered from reality as long as we're sober. There's some connection to reality as it stands. And so it's about taking your internal world model and, as you say, kind of unrolling it and thinking about what would the consequences of different approaches for different things be, different actions in different contexts be. And that can be all the way to, you know, a totally imagined context and a totally imagined set of actions. But nonetheless, you're using your understanding of the world to try to kind of figure out and predict what would be the upcoming thing. And so it's interesting to see that, you know, indeed, our imaginative process seems to be intimately tied into some of the circuits that are responsible potentially for making predictions at a more abstract level, like, interestingly, some of the circuits that are involved in storing episodic memories and extracting regularities from them. So there's a lot of intimate links between all these areas.
That's sweet. This is I thought it was really interesting hearing you talk about the idea of these objective functions first in sort of animals, and then even in humans it becomes even more complicated because I guess like so I feel like there's almost objective functions, non-objective functions. Like
Yeah,
it's like
definitely.
And what they're really trying to objective for themselves. They're trying to decide. This was a sort of a fun philosophical question. If you've figured out what your objective function is yet, or if you're still searching for.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Listen,